Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop my kid off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Good morning, dear listeners. It's a cloudy May 20th here in suburban Chicago, and welcome to the Sesquicentennial episode, the 150th episode of Pick Up and Deliver. Oodalali, it's going to be a good one. I say that. I have very nice questions from some of the regular listeners, so that's about the extent of what makes this episode special, except to note that we're at 150 episodes. So I'm going to jump right into the questions. If you have questions for me for future episodes, feel free to swing by Boardgame Geek Guild 3269 and drop them off in the Pick Up and Deliver Guild, or you can email me, brendan@rattleboxgames.com. For those of you who are finding us for the first time, this is Pick Up and Deliver, a podcast where I talk to you as I'm taking a stroll. And it's useful to do that introduction because regular listener Jason asks, after 150 episodes, what is the biggest change you've made with respect to either your goals or expectations for the podcast compared to your first episodes? Well, I think that my first episodes I had more ambition toward making the episodes carefully crafted, and I spent more time editing them. Early on, I edited them a bit more, and I thought a bit more about what each episode would be. And early on, I dove in really deep. If you look at the publication schedule for the first 70 episodes or so, I was doing 3 a week there for a while. And I guess I still am occasionally, but I had a more orderly approach to it early on. Although I guess I quickly decided that the point of this was to not have to spend a ton of time editing after. So I don't know how long it was before I said, you know what, I'm just gonna record it. And I do edit some. I cut out specifically long gaps, or I will cut out like a big noise from a truck or something. Generally, my approach is I download the recording of the episode, I put it in my editing software, and I play it at 1.5 speed, and I write the show notes while I'm listening to it at 1.5 speed. And if I catch something that sounds bad, or I see a big gap in the audio timeline, then I'll pause it and cut that out and then restart it. And on a good day, I'm able to finish the show notes and create the page for it and create the image for the page, all within the time that it takes me to listen to that episode. And then I'm able to upload it when I'm done, and the whole editing process takes about a half an hour on the high end. That's the ideal situation for me. In terms of goals for the show, I don't know that I have a lot, except to say that I had this time in my schedule that I wanted to use productively, and I felt like talking with other people in the community about my ideas for board gaming was good. I used to keep a blog pretty regularly, and this has kind of taken the place of the blog. The advantage being, or it serves the same purpose for me, which is it lets me think about things I've encountered, in this case particularly board game related things, in a way that's public, but also as much for myself as others. So if this podcast seems a little self-indulgent sometimes, it's because it specifically is self-indulgent. Have you met any people, gaming friends or otherwise, or played games that you likely wouldn't have had you never decided to start the podcast? I feel like the two people I've gotten to know best from the podcast are Wes and Chris, both regular listeners and both Chicago area friends. Wes, I feel like I met once before the podcast, but we really connected after I started doing it, and then we've played online quite a bit and in person a little. And Chris comes to Toggle Gaming, the game group that I go to, and he and I had met a little bit there, but it felt like our friendship grew quite a bit once he started listening to the podcast, and we were able to talk about that a bit. Although I might have that out of order. It might be that our friendship started to grow and then he started to listen to the podcast. So, and I've gotten to know some of you over the Board Game Geek Guild, which has been fun as well. I don't have a good sense of our listenership. I mean, we have 14 regular members in the guild, and they're people from all over the world. So I appreciate getting to know you as I correspond with you. That said, I'm hoping if I'm at conventions, I'll let you know before I go and hopefully get to meet a listener or two. That would be fun. All right, regular listener Doug, or Douglas, asks, have you used a game to bridge a relationship in conflict? If yes, can you give details? I don't think so. I thought about this quite a bit, and I feel like for me, games are a pleasure experience, and so I have trouble imagining a relationship in conflict through that I would use a board game to bridge. That said, I have played games before with people I don't like very much and enjoyed the game time with them just fine. And I guess maybe after that I felt a little more collegial toward them. But generally it's hard to say. I do use games in my classrooms. It's pretty rare that I'll teach a class where we don't use a game at all. Almost every class I teach, I find an excuse to use a game or two. Some of the classes we do a lot of gaming, like board games and literature. I think there's a lot of value in thinking through philosophical and narrative questions through gaming rather than other kinds of interactions. Gaming gives a different approach to an experience. It provides different motivations and gives you something to talk about in a way that you interacted with the text differently than you would if you read it or watched it. So, like for instance, when we talk about Invasion of the Body Snatchers in my zombie class, and we're talking about the paranoia of the doctor and his girlfriend, Becky and Miles, having played the Resistance and trying to think about how we're resisting this overwhelming force of body snatchers, and there are some body snatchers hidden in the group with us. That sort of thing works really well. I found that good. What game do I wish I'd developed, or game I play and wonder why I hadn't thought of it before? Well, I guess Rob and I are working on a variety of Rob is my game design partner. We work on a variety of different designs, and I'm really enjoying that. The games that I work on tend to feel a lot closer to Vladimir Suchy, I think, or at least the Hollywood one I've been working on a bit lately. So I guess, when I play a really great game, I'm envious of the designer for having come up with it. But I don't know that there's any games that I specifically have felt like, oh man, why didn't I think of that? I haven't really had that experience too much. So not a particular part of my experience. What is my favorite component in a game? I really like the exosuit minis in Anachrony. I think putting the worker in the mini and then putting the mini out on the worker placement area is a really effective way to do it, and I think just using the hexes and putting the minis on there is a lot less elegant. I think that while the exosuit minis, they're a bit gaudy as well, the functionality of putting the worker in the mini is a really nice touch. I also, in that same way, I like the little dice holders in Coimbra. They have that same tactile feel to them. I also just really like a good pile of cubes. So I would say generic board game component, I love cubes. Specifics, there's Anachrony and Coimbra. What is my favorite game experience? These are all questions from Douglas, by the way. What is my favorite game experience? I mean, I've had a lot of really great gaming moments. So that's a very hard one to articulate. Strongest gaming memories, I have some very compelling memories from playing role-playing games back in the day, in college mostly, that really stand out to me. Playing Netrunner is a highlight. Almost every game that I played, a couple games in particular stand out as being very memorable, but it's such an intense game that I always enjoy Netrunner. Overall, Pandemic Legacy Season 1 is an excellent game experience as a sort of total process. So I'll offer those three. You notice I'm dodging your favorite element by offering a list, but there it is. What would be my perfect gaming day? I feel like I answered this in a previous podcast, so I'm going to suggest go look at the other Q&A podcast and see if I answered it there. If not, I will. Let me know on the guild if I didn't, and I will come back to that one. And then user Thomas Christensen posted a couple questions as well. He says, what do you think about the games that invoke other feelings than the usual feelings, that seem to appear in board games. Usually I see joy, frustration, and anger, but I more and more find myself drawn toward games that give me other experiences, like the fear from time stories or despair from this war of mine. I've talked about that a little bit as something I think game developers should strive for, is giving players different experiences within the realm of what you might do in a game. The hyper the hyper sort of shouting, the distilled shouting experience of Happy Salmon is a fantastic one, or the strange experience of playing the mind and just with a group figuring out a kind of rhythm that allows you to do well there. Those are two experiences that I thought are really compelling. I'm intrigued by the games that approach difficult themes. I mentioned on the podcast previously, I got to play Holding On, The Troubled Life of Billy Kerr. The game was okay, but the idea was really neat of it. I haven't played this War of Mine, but it does sound interesting. What are some other feelings that games invoke that are unusual? I think tension is a really good one, particularly the tension of the randomized output. I have on many occasions clenched my fists and held them up to my mouth in terror as I wait for a die roll or a card draw in a cooperative game. But I do suggest that is a sort of within the scope of normal board game feeling. It'd be interesting to think what are some of those other feelings that board games can try to pursue. And I think there is something to be asked for. Is that pleasurable? Like, it's, the despair of a game is an interesting notion to go for. Obviously, a really hard co-op traffics in despair. But I think for the most part, board games tend to focus on emotions we want to have. So joy, delight, competitiveness, the thrill of shared achievement. I love games that let you enjoy making something. And that's one of the things I really like about a lot of the sort of so-called soulless Euros. A lot of them function from the idea that you have built something cool anyway at the end, even if you weren't really thinking about the relationship of, even if the thing you built, what's the word I'm looking for? Even if you don't win, you've built something cool and it feels good. And so that kind of outcome I really enjoy. So I think that kind of wraps up that does wrap up the question. Those are all the questions I got. I guess it's interesting to sort of ponder at 150 episodes what I'm trying to get out of this. I certainly am enjoying it. I don't see myself stopping anytime soon. I like the license I've given myself to not release even 2 episodes a week if I don't feel like it, although I do generally feel like it. It's interesting, the experience lately has not been that I don't feel like it, but rather I'm not sure what the episode should be about, and I want it to be worthwhile for you. I don't want this podcast to be one where you tune in and it just feels the same old, or it feels like I'm not doing anything, which the point of the podcast is to spend time when I wasn't going to use it productively anyway. But then putting more thought into it kind of defeats the purpose a little. Nonetheless, that's kind of what I lean toward. So I'm looking forward to continuing to do more episodes and continuing to enjoy it. And I hope that you are enjoying it as well. That does go to one last question. I posted this in the guild as well, but I recognize we have 14 guild members, so most of you who are listening don't participate in the guild, I presume. So I'm not generally a very stats conscious guy in terms of the podcast. I don't spend a lot of time looking at our statistics for downloads and that sort of thing, but occasionally I do. And when I was uploading last week's second episode, I noticed something really weird, that the traffic in terms of live plays of the podcast and downloads of the podcast had basically between doubled and tripled in the last week. Like basically starting last Monday, I saw a much higher download rate than I'd seen before. And I mean, I thought the episode on Monday was fine, but I don't really know why. Like in the past, I did an episode about the Jacob Krzyzlowski guy, the guy who did the art for Scythe, when there was some controversy about whether his art was too copied or not. And so I did an episode about that, and I posted a link to the episode in Board Game Geek and on Reddit, and it didn't surprise me that that particular episode got a lot of downloads. But I don't know of anything particular that happened that should have led to a sudden uptick in our audience last week. So my initial thought is that some other podcast or some other media source mentioned us, and that we got some referrals from there. A couple listeners have said that they've been telling people about the podcast, which is awesome, but unless they have access to a really strong audience, again, I'm not sure where suddenly last Monday we got a significant uptick in listens. So if by chance you came to the podcast last Monday, so you have a sense of why, of where that reference might have come from, if it exists at all. I might be imagining it, but I would enjoy knowing where the reference came from so that I can